In the heart of an old, forgotten town lies a house that time seems to have forgotten. Once a grand manor, it now stands in ruin, its walls cracked, its windows shattered, and its doors hanging loosely on their hinges. The locals dare not approach it, for they know the stories of those who entered and never returned. It was said that the house had a history, a dark one, filled with tales of sorrow, madness, and death. The previous owner, a reclusive man named Mr. Whitaker, was rumored to have been a practitioner of dark arts, dabbling in forbidden rituals that drew the attention of malevolent spirits. His wife, a kind and gentle woman, was driven to madness by the things she witnessed until one night she vanished without a trace. The townsfolk spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, of eerie whispers carried by the wind, and of shadows that moved on their own. But the most terrifying of all were the screams, haunting, blood-curdling screams that echoed through the town at the stroke of midnight. No one knew where they came from, but everyone knew better than to investigate. One day, a group of curious teenagers, emboldened by the tales, decided to explore the house. They laughed off the warnings of the old-timers, believing them to be nothing more than superstitions. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they made their way to the house at dusk, the sun setting behind them, casting long, ominous shadows on the ground. The door creaked open with a groan, as if protesting their intrusion. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders as they made their way through the darkened corridors. The floors creaked underfoot, each step echoing through the empty halls. As they ventured deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop, their breath visible in the cold air. One of the boys, the bravest of the group, led them up the grand staircase, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. They reached the top, where a long hallway stretched out before them, lined with doors on either side. It was then that they heard it, the faint sound of music playing from somewhere deep within the house. It was an old melancholic tune, played on a piano, the notes echoing through the empty halls. They exchanged nervous glances, but their curiosity got the better of them, and they followed the sound. The music led them to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and as they pushed it open, they were met with a sight that chilled them to the bone. There in the center of the room sat a grand piano, its keys moving on their own, as if played by invisible hands. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and the air was thick with the scent of roses, as if someone had just placed a fresh bouquet in the room. But there were no roses, only the piano and the shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The music stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on them. And then the whispers began. At first they were soft, almost inaudible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, more insistent, until the words became clear. "Leave! Now!" They urged, the voice low and menacing. The teenagers, their bravado now gone, turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows began to close in on them, twisting and writhing as if alive. And then the screaming started. It was a scream of pure terror, one that seemed to come from all around them, filling the room with a cacophony of sound. Desperate to escape, they pounded on the door, their screams joining the chorus. But it was no use. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in, the shadows pressing against their bodies. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something rotting, something dead. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. The room was silent, the shadows gone, the door swinging open on its own. The teenagers, shaken and terrified, stumbled out of the room and down the stairs, their only thought to escape the house that had nearly claimed them. But as they reached the front door, they realized something was wrong. The house seemed different, the air heavier, the light dimmer. It was as if they had stepped into another world, one that was darker, more sinister. They could feel eyes watching them, could hear the whispers still, faint but persistent, urging them to leave, to run, to never return. But it was too late. As they reached for the door, it slammed shut once more, and the house began to shift around them, the walls closing in, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The portraits on the walls seemed to change, their faces twisting into grotesque visages, their eyes now filled with malice. The leader of the group, desperate to save his friends, ran back up the stairs, calling for the others to follow. But the house had other plans. The shadows returned, more aggressive this time, reaching out with tendrils of darkness, pulling the teenagers into the walls, into the floors, into the very fabric of the house itself. One by one, they disappeared, their screams echoing through the halls until only the leader remained. He fought against the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest, but it was no use. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before. And then there was silence. The house stood still, its walls returning to their decrepit state, the shadows retreating into the corners, the whispers fading into the distance. The door swung open, but there was no one left to walk through it. The townsfolk knew something had happened, but they dared not investigate. They had heard the screams, had seen the lights, but they knew better than to go near the house. It was cursed, they said, a place of darkness, of death. And so, the house stood empty once more, waiting for its next victims, waiting for those foolish enough to ignore the warnings. And so it waits, in silence, in darkness, its secrets hidden within its walls, its horrors forgotten by all but the most daring. But if you listen closely late at night, when the wind is just right, you can still hear the whispers, calling out to those brave enough to enter, to discover the truth, to face the terror within. But beware, for once you enter, you may never leave. The house has a way of keeping those who come to it, of drawing them into its depths, of making them a part of its story. And once you are a part of it, there is no escape. The house will claim you, just as it has claimed so many before. So, if you ever find yourself in that old, forgotten town and you see the house on the hill, turn back, walk away. For if you don't, you may find yourself lost in its halls, trapped in its shadows, and you will never be seen again.